She thought her home was safe, until one discovery changed everything. Watch till the end to see the truth. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories. Sarah Jenkins stepped out of the taxi in front of her suburban home just as the late afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon. The sky glowed with that golden-orange hue that seemed to paint everything in a soft warmth, and for a moment she felt a wave of relief at being back after 2 weeks away. The vacation had been refreshing. Long walks on beaches, quiet mornings in a rented cabin by the sea, but home always had its own comfort, especially after time away. She carried her bags inside, exhaled, and thought about all the small tasks waiting for her. The yard was overgrown. Weeds had sprouted in the garden beds. The air smelled damp, earthy, as if rain had passed recently, soaking the soil. Sarah had always taken pride in maintaining her little backyard. The roses by the fence, the tomato plants, the neatly kept lawn. Now everything seemed just slightly wild, as if her absence had given nature permission to reclaim a bit of ground. She smiled at the thought. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would bring everything back in order. But first, she needed her tools. The shed stood in the corner of the yard, a small wooden structure with peeling paint and a roof that had endured many winters. She hadn't entered it since before leaving for vacation, and as she walked across the lawn, she noticed how quiet the evening was. No bird song, no buzzing of insects. Only the creak of the shed's wooden door when she pulled it open. The smell inside was musty, heavy with dust and damp wood. Shafts of sunlight slipped in through cracks in the walls, illuminating old gardening gloves, a leaning rake, clay pots stacked one on another. Sarah stepped inside, brushing away cobwebs from the doorframe, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. She reached for the toolbox she had left on a shelf, but something in the far corner drew her attention. At first, she thought it was just a tarp left hanging, or perhaps an old bag slung over the rafters, but then she saw it move. Her breath caught. There, suspended from the beams, was something large, oval-shaped, and disturbingly alive. It was nearly 3 feet long, bulging outward with a leathery surface that seemed to pulse, as though it were breathing. The surface twitched with subtle motions, tiny ripples spreading across it like waves. Sarah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What on earth?" she whispered. Every instinct told her to back away, close the door, and pretend she had never seen it. But curiosity held her rooted. She took one careful step closer. The air smelled faintly sour near the thing, a mix of damp earth and something animal. She could hear a faint, rhythmic sound, like the soft thud of a heartbeat buried deep within. Panic welled in her chest. Was it dangerous? Some invasive species? A giant insect nest? The thought of spiders or hornets swarming out of it made her shiver. She staggered back and nearly tripped over a bag of fertilizer. Her first impulse was to grab her phone and call animal control, but when she lifted her phone, another thought came to her. She remembered an article she had read months ago about rare wildlife sightings in the region. There had been reports of unusual bat colonies, particularly of a species called the spotted bat, which conservationists had long considered close to extinction in the state. She swallowed hard, staring again at the grotesque structure hanging in her shed. Could it be connected? Sarah did not call animal control. Instead, she called her neighbor, Mark. He was not a professional biologist, but he was an enthusiastic amateur entomologist and had a fascination with wildlife. Within minutes, Mark arrived, his camera slung over his shoulder and a cautious gleam in his eye. When she opened the shed door for him, he stopped mid-step. "Good God," he muttered. "That's remarkable." "You know what it is?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. Mark walked closer, his hands hovering near but never touching the leathery cocoon. He crouched, studying the surface with the fascination of a scientist faced with something extraordinary. I don't want to say for certain, but if I had to guess, I'd say this is a bat nursery. The spotted bat, maybe. They've been thought to be nearly gone in this region, but this would be a massive roost. Sarah felt a chill ripple down her spine. A roost? In my shed? They're harmless, usually, Mark said quickly, and if these are truly spotted bats, they're protected. People would kill to document a colony like this. Harmless, protected. The words pressed against her fear. She thought of her children, Emma, 12, who loved playing in the yard, and her younger son, Josh, who was barely 9 and endlessly curious about animals. The idea of bats living above them made her uneasy, and yet the thought of destroying something rare, something struggling to survive, struck her as cruel. "So, what do I do?" she asked. Mark hesitated, then shrugged. "Honestly, if they are what I think they are, the best thing you can do is leave them be. Let nature take its course. They'll probably grow, maybe even move on when the conditions change. You could call conservation authorities to confirm, but I doubt they'd recommend removal." Sarah exhaled slowly. Fear still twisted in her stomach, but alongside it came an unexpected swell of pride. She had always thought of herself as an ordinary woman, tending her garden, raising her kids, working her part-time job at the library. But now she might be the guardian of something rare, something extraordinary. "All right," she said at last. "I'll leave them." Mark nodded, though he gave her a searching look as if to ask if she was truly sure. But Sarah closed the shed door and locked it. For the first time in her life, she felt as though her backyard held a secret far larger than herself. That night, lying in bed, she could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the cocoon swaying from the rafters, pulsing in the darkness, alive with something hidden. She told herself she had made the right choice. It was an endangered species. It deserved protection. But deep inside, beneath the layers of reason and pride, a sliver of unease remained. What if leaving it there was a mistake? Sarah pushed the thought aside, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Tomorrow, she would tell her children about the discovery. She would explain that they must stay out of the shed. She would make sure they understood the importance of respecting life. Still, in the quiet of her room, she could almost hear it. The faint, steady beat of something growing in the dark corner of her shed, waiting for the moment to break free. By the end of the week, the house learned a new heartbeat. It began as a whisper at dusk, thin, papery rustles that seemed to come from the rafters of the shed, and, as darkness deepened, from somewhere higher, somewhere closer. Sarah would be rinsing plates at the kitchen sink when the air, all at once, felt thinner, quickened, as if a veil were lifting over the yard. A tremor of sound, almost like rain on leaves, gathered and separated into countless tiny notes. She would glance out the window over the sink, and for a breathless instant, the sky above the fence flickered with silhouettes the size of sparrows. Then they were gone. On the third evening after returning from vacation, the cocoon finally opened. She didn't witness the first tear, only the aftermath, a humped seam splitting down the leathery mass, edges peeled like a fruit's thick skin. Mark arrived within minutes of her message, flashlight in hand, his face lit with the startled reverence of someone who has been waiting a long time to see a myth breathe. "Look," he whispered. She leaned in behind him. From the sundered husk, the smallest bodies clung together in a quivering knot, damp, charcoal dark, patterned with pale freckles that caught the beam of the flashlight. The sound they made was not a sound at all so much as a pressure, a faint high frequency that hovered just on the edge of hearing. It made the tiny hairs on Sarah's arms stir. "They're newborns," Mark said, barely moving his lips. "Spotted bats. Sarah, this is extraordinary." A hush fell over them. The shed seemed suddenly cathedral-like with its slanted roof and slivers of evening light spearing through the boards. Sarah forgot the smell, forgot the dust and the disarray. There was only this improbable congregation of life, delicate and insistent and impossibly rare, clinging to the place she kept her rakes. She should have been frightened, she remembered thinking it, even as a warmth rose in her chest. Instead, she felt a strange solemnity, as if the shed had asked her to witness a vow. In that moment, guilt at intruding replaced fear. She stepped back and nodded for Mark to lower the light. "We should let them settle," she said. He agreed, though his eyes were alive with questions. Outside, in the gentling dusk, he gave her the practical warnings. Don't disturb them. Keep the kids away. Avoid handling anything that might be contaminated. He mentioned diseases as a general caution, the way you might mention slick roads after a rainfall, but emphasized again how protected the species was, how rare this nursery must be. "If you alert conservation, they'll probably want to document it. It could be a good thing," he said, studying her expression. "And temporary." "Temporary," she repeated, liking the shape of the word. That night, she told Emma and Josh. They sat at the kitchen table with cups of cocoa steaming between their hands while she explained, carefully, what lived now in the shed. She spoke about endangered species the way she would speak about a book she loved, softly, with care. The children listened, fascinated, then asked the questions she had rehearsed answers to in her head. "Are they dangerous?" Josh asked. "They're wild animals," she said, "so we give them space. We don't go into the shed for a while. We keep windows closed at dusk. We let them be." Emma, older, studied her. "And if they don't leave?" "They will," Sarah said, and made sure her voice was steady. For a few days the colony grew in quiet ways. She learned the rhythm of it. Near sunrise there was a softening in the air as the tiny bodies returned, whispering along the eaves, vanishing through hairline gaps under the roof line, a brief storm returning to its cloud. Near sunset, the shed brightened inside with an odd, disembodied alertness, as if something invisible had opened an eye. She could feel them, even before she heard them, and the feeling tugged at her, equal parts awe and vigilance. Then the changes grew obvious. It began with a dusting of grit on the patio table beneath the eaves. Sarah wiped it away with the side of her hand and frowned without naming it. The next morning, there was more. She followed a trail of specks to the seam where the shed roof met the house and saw, for the first time, the slight darkening along the wood, stains that hadn't been there before. She told herself it was weather, the usual mildew after rain. She would clean it this weekend, she decided, when she had time. By the weekend, the smell announced itself before she opened the back door. A sweet sour note like wet straw gone bad. She hesitated on the step, then carried a trash bag and gloves to the shed and eased the door wide. Inside, the air had thickened. Guano stippled the floor in constellations of brown-gray. She stared, a little stunned at the transformation. A week ago, the shed had been a museum of her modest life. Terracotta pots, a rake, a coil of hose. Now it had become something else's idea of home. She cleaned because cleaning was how she knew to restore order. She wore a mask, remembering Mark's cautions. She moved quietly, brooming the floor in gentle strokes to avoid raising dust. The cocoon hung split and useless now, a curtain that had already performed its miracle and retired to the edge of the stage. Above, along the rafters, she glimpsed the small dark commas of bodies, clustered in a breathing mass, and she drew breath with them. They were sleeping. She felt the rare privilege of being permitted to tidy while a secret slept overhead. When she was done, the floor looked like itself again. She stepped outside and stood with her hands on her hips, squinting into the late morning light. She would seal that gap under the eaves soon, she thought, just to discourage drafts. Not to trap anything, not to force a departure, just to make the house feel less porous. Temporary, she reminded herself, this is temporary. That afternoon, Mark stopped by with a printout from an online database and a neat, excited speech about roosting preferences and regional sightings. "I've reached out to a local conservation group," he said, then caught himself, "only to ask general questions. I didn't mention your address." "Thank you," Sarah said, grateful and uneasy in equal measure. "They recommend observation for now," he added. "Minimal disturbance. The colony may relocate as the young learn to fly." As the young learn to fly. The phrase felt like an incantation for patience. She imagined a tide going out, pulling the little lives with it, leaving her yard ordinary again. But the next change was not a tide receding, it was a tide turning. The first evening she noticed it, Emma was doing homework at the kitchen island while Josh built a precarious tower of blocks on the floor. The sun had already slid below the fence, and the yard had gone from gold to ash, blue deepening in the spaces between things. Sarah was chopping onions when a fluttering burst like a shaken sheet erupted in the air over the lawn. The sound, more felt than heard, rippled through the open window. Emma looked up. Josh's tower fell. "Close the window," Sarah said gently, already moving to do so herself. As she slid the pane down, a smear of dark shapes swung through the fading light and vanished along the roofline. The soft tick-ticks of tiny claws found purchase somewhere just overhead. A second later, the house gave the faintest shiver, as though the roof itself had exhaled. "Cool," Josh whispered, eyes wide. "Remember," Sarah said and made her voice calm, "we don't go outside after dark for now, not without me." "We know," Emma said, but her gaze lingered on the window, drawn to the unseen, the way one might be drawn to the deep end of a pool. The nights grew noisier. It was not volume so much as persistence, that thin seam of sound needling through the walls, the drip-drip of something unnameable in the attic, the occasional soft rattle like fingertips bracing on drywall. Twice, toward midnight, Sarah rose from bed and padded into the hallway to stand under the attic hatch, listening. A smell came down from there now, not always, but often enough to make her breathe through her mouth. Sharp, ammoniac, edged with something animal and sweet. She told herself to be reasonable. Nature was close. Nature was messy. Hadn't she invited it? On Saturday, she hauled the ladder in from the garage and set it beneath the hatch. She did not open it. She only stood there, one hand on the ladder's rung, feeling the coolness of aluminum against her palm, imagining the darkness above. If she opened it, she might see the clustered bodies, see the slick brightness of their eyes in her flashlight, and, by seeing, disturb them. She left the ladder leaning all day like a promise she had not decided to keep. In the afternoon, Mark swung by the fence with a wave and a cautious smile. "How's it going, Guardian?" "Messier," she said, attempting a laugh. "But I'm managing." He studied her face. "You know, I have to say it. Keep the kids away, keep the pets in at night, and maybe move the dog's water bowl inside." "We don't have a dog," she said, and he colored, then shrugged. "Then just be careful. Guano accumulates fast. It can damage wood. And the smell—" "I can handle the smell," she said too quickly. He nodded. "It's also a signal. to them. Strong roost cues keep colonies in place. She heard the word keep and pretended it comforted her. After he left, she swept the back step and told herself again, temporary. The word had thinned, like a thread pulled too many times through fabric. By the second week, the bats had outgrown the shed. She didn't see them move in. She felt the house accept them. First in the attic space over the hallway, then above Emma's room where the ceiling met the outer wall. At dawn, as the children slept, a murmurous eddying traveled the length of the roof and settled, the way wind sometimes crosses a field and lays the grass down in one direction. Sarah stood barefoot on the hallway runner, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she didn't drink, and taught herself to breathe with the sound. That day, faint brownish crescents appeared near a vent grate where the wall met the ceiling. She wiped them away with a damp cloth and closed the vent. In the evening, the crescents returned. "You're worried," Emma said later, catching her mother watching the ceiling. "I'm paying attention," Sarah answered. "That's different." But the difference grew harder to feel. The laundry started to carry a trace of the attic with it. The guest room, which no one used, took on the dim, loamy chill of a cave. Twice, a soft scratch moved along the inside of the wall behind the bookshelf. Too quick for mice, too deliberate for pipes. Josh asked if they could sleep in the living room like a campout. Sarah said no and smiled, but she checked the windows twice that night, then again. She promised herself she would call someone on Monday, not to remove, just to consult, to hear a soothing authority say the word temporary with conviction. But Monday brought errands and afternoon traffic and a call from work about a scheduling change. She didn't call. On Tuesday, she found a thin fan of guano across the sill of the attic hatch. She wiped it, scrubbed, and then stared at her own hands, at the faint tremor in her fingers, at the way the smell seemed to cling even after 2 rinses. She told herself she was overreacting. She was tired. She would nap. She did not nap. She sat instead at the kitchen table with her laptop open, cursor blinking in a search bar, and then she closed it without typing a word. After sunset, the house lifted again on the wings of many small lives. Sarah stood at the back door, the glass reflecting her face faintly as the sky behind her went dark. For a moment, she felt what she had felt in the shed on the day of the hatching, the hush, the permission, the sense that she was tending a miracle that needed only her patience. "Mom?" Emma said behind her, voice careful. "Mark told me today he thinks they might not leave on their own." Sarah kept her gaze on the glass so she wouldn't have to turn and calibrate her expression. "Mark likes to prepare for every possibility. He said we should be careful," Emma went on, and then, very softly, "I don't like the way it smells in my room." Sarah closed her eyes. The guilt that sprang up was quick, a live thing. "We'll figure it out," she said. It's part of it, for now." "For now?" Emma echoed. She didn't press. Later, when the house had settled into its uneasy nocturne, Sarah lay awake listening to the roof breathe. The word she had used to steady everyone, temporary, lay on her tongue like a coin gone tasteless with too much handling. She tried to place the feeling gathering in her. Was it dread? No, not yet. Something smaller and more stubborn, like a pebble in a shoe you keep telling yourself you don't have time to remove. In the dark, the attic shifted, a skitter, then a softness, then silence thick as fur. She pictured the colony above her, the small freckled bodies tight together, the cramped hush of their sleep, the trigger in their strange little hearts that would flood their blood with flight at the last seam of daylight. She thought again of rarity, of protection, of doing the right thing. She reminded herself, one more time, that they would go, that all she had to do was endure the mess and the noise and the smell a little longer. That patience surely would be enough. She turned her face into the pillow and pretended the air did not taste of the attic. Morning would come, and with it sunlight that made everything ordinary again. Morning would bring coffee and school drop-off and emails and the distraction of small human errands. Morning would make it easy to believe in temporary. For now, the house breathed. And Sarah breathed with it, lying very still, listening to the new heartbeat she had allowed into her home. The first real signs of trouble arrived quietly, almost too subtle to name. Sarah wanted to believe that everything was under control, that patience was all she needed. Yet the house itself seemed to resist that illusion. It began with the ceilings. She noticed faint, oily marks spreading along the upper corners of the hallway. At first, she thought it was water damage, but when she touched the stain, it felt gritty, layered with fine powder. A sour, animal smell followed her hand, and she scrubbed it clean with soap and hot water. The next morning, the stain was back, slightly larger. From the attic came a new sound. It was not the scattered flutter of wings that she had learned to expect at dusk, but a restless scratching, a dragging shuffle that moved along the beams long after midnight. The noise had a rhythm to it, a persistence that made her heart race in the dark. Several times she sat upright in bed, holding her breath as if the colony could sense her unease. She told herself it was natural, animals shifting in their roost, but the sound pressed against her nerves until her chest felt tight. Her children began to notice. One morning, Emma appeared at the breakfast table pale and tired. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "It sounded like something was crawling over my ceiling all night." Josh, trying to joke, added, "Maybe they're coming for us." His words made Sarah snap more sharply than she meant. "Don't say that. They're not dangerous." Both children fell silent. The room felt colder than it had moments before. Mark returned one evening with a small notebook and photographs of bat colonies he had studied online. He sat across from Sarah in the kitchen, flipping through the pages while the smell of guano wafted faintly from the vents. "Look," he said, showing her an image of rafters blackened by droppings. "This is what can happen if they settle in too long. It doesn't just smell, it corrodes wood, carries disease. Rabies isn't common, but histoplasmosis, it's real. People get sick." Sarah folded her arms, defensive despite herself. "You said they were rare. You said they were protected." "I did," Mark admitted. "And they are, but protection doesn't mean harmless. There's a line between conservation and safety. You need to think about your kids." His words lingered long after he left. That night, Sarah climbed the hallway ladder and pressed her ear against the attic hatch. A wave of warmth and stink pushed down from the gap. She could hear them, hundreds of tiny bodies, squirming, shifting, whispering to each other in frequencies that buzzed just outside of human range. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine them only as rare wonders of nature, but another image forced itself into her mind. A swarm spilling downward, filling the rooms where her children slept. The days grew heavier. Laundry carried the faint ammonia tang of guano, no matter how many times she washed it. Guests hesitated at the front door, wrinkling their noses. Emma began insisting on sleeping with the light on, her schoolwork suffering from exhaustion. Josh asked if they could move his bed to the living room. Sarah told herself these were just inconveniences. Temporary. Always temporary. But the colony was changing. The bats were no longer the fragile newborn creatures she had first seen in the split cocoon. They were larger now, bolder. At dusk, Instead of slipping quietly from the attic, they burst forth in a storm that rattled the shutters and sent shadows streaking across the lawn. Their numbers seemed to double every week. Once, Sarah watched through the kitchen window as a cluster swooped low over the swing set where her children had once played carefree. The sight turned her stomach. One afternoon, she found Emma sitting on the back step, hugging her knees, eyes fixed on the shed. "I don't like them," the girl said quietly. "They're not special. They're scary." Sarah knelt beside her, brushing hair from her daughter's face. "They won't hurt us," she whispered, though the conviction in her voice faltered. "They'll move on soon." But even as she spoke, she saw a flicker of movement in the dark slit of the shed's roof, and a wave of unease washed through her. The turning point came with the dog. A neighbor's golden retriever strayed into Sarah's yard one evening. Moments later, a dark surge erupted from the attic vent, swirling round the animal in a frenzy. The dog yelped, tail tucked, and bolted back through the fence, leaving tufts of fur scattered across the grass. Sarah stood frozen at the window, hand over her mouth. When silence returned, she realized her hands were trembling. She could no longer ignore it. What had begun as an act of kindness, protecting a rare species, had become something else, something darker. She had given them sanctuary, and now her home was no longer her own. Sarah lay awake that night, listening to the attic breathe above her, every scratch and flutter echoing in her bones. She knew Mark was right. She knew her children's fear was real, and deep down, beneath the guilt and stubborn pride, she knew this would not end with the bats leaving quietly on their own. It would end with something breaking. The day unraveled like thread from a snag. Nothing dramatic at first, only the small frictions that pull a life taut. A plumbing appointment ran long. The library called to ask if Sarah could cover a 2-hour shift because a coworker's car wouldn't start. She told Emma she'd be back before dinner, reminded both kids, again, not to open windows at dusk, not to touch the attic hatch, not to linger in the yard when the light began to fade. Emma rolled her eyes in the theatrical way of 12-year-olds, but she nodded. Josh promised, solemn as a scout. By late afternoon, the air had turned heavy with heat, a summer thickness that made doors swell in their frames. Inside the house it felt close and dull. The window units worked, but their effect was more psychological than real, and the smell that had woven itself into the wallpaper, ammoniac and sour, seemed sharper than usual. Emma cracked her bedroom window an inch without thinking, then, remembering, pushed it closed and locked the latch. She did not check the vent above her closet. At 6:23 p.m., with the sky still pale, Sarah backed out of the driveway, glanced at the house, and felt that familiar prickle between the shoulders, a mother's sixth sense that never quite goes quiet. It passed when she turned the corner. She told herself she was overreacting, that dusk was still an hour away, that she would be home well before the colony woke. In the house, the clock on the stove ticked from 6:29 to 6:30. Josh sprawled on the living room rug with his spaceship kit. Emma sat at the kitchen island, earbuds in, pencil tapping. The dog next door barked twice and fell silent. It was the kind of ordinary calm that invites you to forget what lives on the other side of your ceiling. The first hint was not sound, but pressure, as if the air itself gave a minute shudder that only the bones could feel. Emma pulled the bud from her ear. "Josh," she called, "do you hear that?" He didn't answer. In his game, an entire galaxy hinged on the alignment of two plastic pieces. The shudder passed. She put the bud back in and returned to her fractions. On the roof, along the ridge where shingles met sky, something flowed. At first a soft recirculation, then an intention. Inside the attic, the colony shifted as one organism, bodies loosening from their cluster, claws briefly clicking, the hush before a storm takes its first breath. There was no sunset yet, but the light had thinned enough to suggest it, and the heat had built higher than usual under the roof. Instinct, ancient, indifferent, told 100 small hearts the hour had come. The vent above Emma's closet blade whispered. She looked up, frowning. The slats seemed to quiver, then stilled. A moment later, a thin line of dust fell from the seam where the vent met the drywall, sprinkling the shelf below with fine brown grit. Emma slid off her stool. "Josh, pause it," she said, tugging one earbud out again. "Something's wrong with the vent cover flexed outward with a papery slip. A shape the size of a fist pushed through, then another behind it, then many, each one testing the opening, each one emboldening the next. For an instant, everything froze. Emma's hand lifted in reflex, the shapes crouched in a hush of potential. Then the cover popped free, clattered to the floor, and the room filled with moving dark. They were not the soft, uncertain creatures she had seen in photos. They were sleek and quick, peppered with pale flecks like stars, wings unfurling with a crisp, leathery snap that multiplied as more bodies poured from the vent. The air thinned with their motion. Emma stumbled backward, bumping the island. A bat skimmed her cheek. Only air, only the idea of touch, and she gasped, the sound high and small. "Josh!" she shouted, voice breaking on the name. He looked up and his face changed. The first line of bats swept into the hallway, then arced back as if tugged by an invisible tide, circling low over the kitchen light. Another wave followed. The house that had been a house was suddenly a cave, angles and drywall erased by the geometry of flight, the rooms mapped now in currents and echoes rather than walls and doors. "What do we do?" Josh asked, voice almost a whisper, because shouting felt like the wrong language in this new physics. Emma's brain flipped through a deck of rules. Close the windows, don't swat, don't run. She grabbed Josh by the wrist and drew him toward the living room, instinct driving her to the center of the house, away from vents and doorways. The bats swirled above them, a storm without rain. She ducked, steering Josh under the archway. One collided with the picture frame by the stairs and rebounded with a sharp, small sound that made her flinch. Another brushed Emma's hair, and she slapped at it without meaning to, hand striking only air. From the attic hatch in the hallway ceiling came a skittering, then a soft, sustained tearing, the thin veneer of caulk giving way where wood had swelled in the heat. The hatch was latched, but the seam widened a fraction. Air breathed down along the edges, carrying the concentrated smell from above. The colony poured toward the openings that offered pressure and scent. Vents, the seam at the hatch, the narrow gap where the upstairs bathroom fan cover rattled in its housing. "Into the laundry room," Emma said, thinking smaller, thinking door and threshold and space she could seal. She propelled Josh that way. They crossed the kitchen like runners under a hail of paper birds that were not birds. In the doorway, a bat dropped from a clumsy angle and clawed for purchase, and its tiny feet grazed Josh's forearm and he yelped, more surprise than pain. Emma shoved him through and slammed the door, heart a drum in her throat. The laundry room hummed with the dryer's low heat. Emma twisted the lock. Through the hollow core door, the house sounded like a shaken jar of pebbles. The vent near the ceiling in the laundry room was closed. She stared at it, willing it to stay that way, then dragged the ironing board beneath it and climbed up, mashing the plastic latch tighter with the heel of her hand. Josh's breath came fast behind her. "Are they in here?" he whispered. "No," she said, though her eyes never left the vent. "We're okay. Mom will be home any minute." The door rattled. Not from a hand, but from the turbulence in the hall, bodies striking the wood with the errors of their frenzied flight. A quick, dry series of taps ran along the jamb like rain. Emma forced herself to breathe slowly, to listen the way her mother listened at night when she stood under the attic hatch, assessing, measuring. In the silence between taps, a thin, unmistakable sound threaded through. A whimper. Not Josh. Emma turned. He was looking at her, eyes wide, mouth set. The sound came from her own throat, and she clamped her jaw until it stopped. The minutes stretched. Heat swelled. The air in the small room tasted like lint and detergent and fear. Josh sat on the floor and folded into himself, chin on knees. "Why are they doing this?" he asked. "They're animals," Emma said, fighting for steady. "They don't know where they are. They're just following smells and air and each other." Explanation offered its own thin comfort. Names returned you to a world you could navigate. Then the house changed key. The attic hatch gave a muffled, splitting crack, wood complaining, a nail head shearing. Emma and Josh both flinched. A second later came a ripple, not of many small bodies but a weight. It moved through the hall, down the stairs, under the door at floor level as pressure and sound. A larger presence among the small, or simply more of them compressed into less space. Emma felt it in her ankles. "Closet," she said, "now." They scrambled into the laundry closet, thin bifold doors that had never been meant for defense. She pulled them shut and held the knobs together with both hands. Josh wedged his shoulder against the crack. Through the slats, they watched the laundry room in stripes. The door, the vent, the rectangle of ceiling. It might have held. Maybe the colony would have tired of this useless room, flowed past it on its blind calculus and sought exits elsewhere. Maybe. The vent cover in the laundry room clicked. Emma's body reacted faster than thought. She leapt from the closet, dragged the step stool under the vent, and reached up, pressing both palms flat against the plastic. "Hold it," she hissed to no one, to the house. The cover vibrated against her hands. On the other side, claws scrabbled against the mesh, a texture of movement like leaves against a screen. Josh was crying now without sound, the way a person cries when all the air has been stolen by noise. The cover bowed. Her palms slid with sweat. A tiny wedge of space opened along the top edge, and through it came not a body but smell, dense, sharp, exhausting. Emma gagged. She pushed harder. Something gave, not the cover, but her balance. The stool wobbled. She threw out a hand, hitting the wall with her knuckles. The cover snapped back into place. For a heartbeat, the room was still. The door handle turned. A scream burst in her throat and died when she saw her mistake. It was only the house, the turbulence in the hall again, the handle twitching from the ripple as if tested by an invisible hand. She barked a laugh that was almost a sob and climbed down from the stool, legs trembling. They waited. The sound beyond the door changed again. No longer the wild, circling chaos of a disoriented mass, but a thinner, more purposeful motion, streams finding their channels. Emma pictured them flowing into vents, down chases, out along the soffits, riding the pressure to the edges of the house. She clung to that image, willed it into prediction. At 7:11 p.m., Sarah turned onto their street. The sky had done that late summer trick of holding on to daylight too long, then dropping it all at once. Houses glowed in their windows. Lawns lay strangely muted, as though sound had been absorbed into the grass. Sarah felt the prickle again, stronger this time, bald as an alarm. She pressed the accelerator, then immediately scolded herself and lifted her foot. It was nothing. It was fine. They were fine. She parked crooked, left the engine ticking, and jogged up the walk. The porch light was on. Behind the glass, the foyer looked normal. But the moment she cracked the door, heat hit her, and with it a smell so concentrated it seemed to have weight. She gagged. The hallway light fixture swung a fraction, not from wind, but from currents that had nothing to do with weather. A dark shape zipped through the foyer above her head and vanished toward the dining room. "Emma! Josh!" she shouted, voice raw. "Laundry room!" Emma cried, so fast and loud that it barely sounded like her. Sarah moved and the world narrowed to motion. Bats blurred above the staircase like thrown ink. One skimmed her hair and she ducked on instinct, teeth bared in a grimace that was not a smile. She sprinted past the living room archway, shoulder brushing the jamb, and banged into the laundry room door with her hip. "It's me," she said, already fumbling the lock. The door swung inward. 2 children were inside a box. Emma's face was gray, eyes huge. Josh's cheeks were streaked with dirt and tears. Sarah pulled them both to her, a quick inventory by touch, head, shoulders, arms, before holding them away. "Are you hurt?" Josh shook his head. Emma began, and the sentence was erased by a new sound, a thin, panicked keening from the hallway. It took Sarah a second to understand it was coming from her own throat. She forced it down. "We're leaving now," she said. "Shoes, go." They shoved feet into sneakers by the back door. Sarah snagged her phone from the counter. On the screen, 3 missed calls from Mark. She didn't look at the time. She led them to the patio, flinching when a bat pinwheeled against the sliding glass and rebounded like a dark, soft ball. The outside air felt like water after smoke. She closed the door behind them and locked it, a useless gesture that felt like a spell. On the patio, the sound changed again. Outside, the bats' flight made sense. Their arcs had space to describe themselves. They rose and dipped in a salt and pepper cloud above the roof line, then funneled outward toward the alley, torn between the house's strong roost cues and the open grammar of night. The yard smelled like cut grass and something rancid under it. Sarah turned her children to face her. "Count with me," she said, because counting was a bridge back to earth. They stood in the amber wash of the porch light and counted breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Mom," Emma whispered, and Sarah saw then what panic had edited from her vision inside. A thin, fresh, angry line across Emma's left cheek, just under the eye, beaded with blood. Not deep, not catastrophic, but wrong in a way that sent cold through Sarah's wrists and up into her chest. "How?" she said, already pulling a clean dish towel from the grill cart, pressing it gently against the scratch. "When they came through the vent," Emma said. Her voice shook once and steadied. "I'm okay." Josh stared at the towel as if it were a flag. "Does it have... Are we gonna..." "No," Sarah said. "No." The conviction in her voice now was not an arrangement of sound. It was a decision. The line between conservation and safety, the one Mark had drawn with his careful voice, burned into hard relief. She had believed she could occupy both sides of it by waiting long enough. She had been wrong. She thumbed Mark's number. He answered on the first ring. "I tried you. Are you home? Are the kids?" "We're outside," she said. "They're inside. It's bad. Emma's scratched. I'm calling animal control." "I'll come," he said. "Stay outside. Don't try to..." "I won't," she said, and ended the call to dial the county dispatcher. Words carried better now. She heard herself describe the situation in clipped sentences. Protected species inside the house, minor injury to a child, immediate threat, request for emergency wildlife response. The dispatcher's voice was practiced calm. Help was on the way. Do not re-enter the structure. Keep children separated from pets and avoid contact with guano. Wash the wound with soap and water if possible. Avoid the inside of the house. I understand, Sarah said, but the understanding felt like a verdict handed down after a trial she hadn't attended. She looked up at the roofline. The stream of bodies continued, thinner now, as if the house were gradually exhaling them. The patio light caught their bellies as quick, pale dashes. They were not monsters. They were only themselves. That was the cruelty. Harm without malice, a wound inflicted by a shape of life doing what it knew to do. "Mom," Josh said, small, "are we in trouble?" "No," she said, and gathered them both in so tight. "We're safe." Mark arrived breathless, hair flattened with sweat, a headlamp askew on his forehead, and a pair of leather gloves stuffed in his belt like talismans. He stopped when he saw Emma's cheek. "I'm so sorry," he said, the apology weighted far beyond its words. "It's not yours to carry," Sarah said, and surprised them both by keeping her voice even. "We made a choice, and now we're making another one." Sirens approached but did not wail. The soft whoop of municipal vehicles run at low volume. 2 trucks pulled to the curb. Animal Control and County Wildlife Services. 3 officers, calm in a way that had nothing to do with indifference, stepped into the yard with long-handled nets, sealable crates, and a practiced choreography that made space itself feel safer. Sarah found herself narrating for them as if some part of her needed to testify. The cocoon, the decision to leave it, the weeks of noise and smell, the gradual spread into the attic, the vent, the living room, the door handle twitching on its own. When she reached the part where the vent cover fell and the room filled, her voice thinned. One officer, a woman with graying hair tucked under a cap, nodded without judgment. "We'll sweep, secure, and relocate," she said. "We've got a rehab partner and a protected roost in the county preserve. We'll need you to sign a release. And your daughter, she needs to be seen tonight." "We'll go as soon as you're inside," Sarah said. They waited by the fence while the professionals went to work. It was astonishing how quickly competence changed the feel of a place. The officers moved like a tide in reverse, closing doors, taping vents, sealing seams, turning the chaotic air into rooms again. Through the glass, bats wheeled and were guided, gently, decisively, toward nets and crates. There was nothing cruel in it, only an insistence that danger had to stop where children had to sleep. On the patio, Sarah rinsed Emma's cheek with bottled water and soap from the garden caddy, the way the dispatcher had instructed. The cut looked angrier once clean, but it also looked smaller, bounded. She dabbed it dry and pressed a fresh towel over it lightly. Emma stood very still, shoulders square, as if this were a test she intended to pass. Josh leaned against Sarah's hip and did not pretend not to. As the last light left the yard, the stream of bats thinned to a few confused stragglers. The officers signaled to each other and shifted their work indoors entirely. A crate lid clicked, another. The porch light buzzed. Somewhere inside, tape tore from a roll and made a sound like a zipper closing on a suitcase before a long trip. Sarah did not allow herself to look at the house as a failure. She looked at it as a place returning to itself. When the lad officer emerged, she wiped her forearms with a disinfectant cloth and came straight to Emma. "We'll give you the paperwork and the follow-up instructions," she said gently. "A nurse at County ER will check the wound, and the doc will advise on prophylaxis. It's precautionary, but it's important." Emma nodded. Sarah took the offered forms without reading them. She would read them in the waiting room, under too bright light, with Josh asleep on her shoulder and the smell of antiseptic cutting clean lines through her memory of the evening. Mark touched Sarah's elbow just once. "You did the right thing," he said. It was not consolation. It was a sentence with weight. Sarah looked at Emma's face, at the thin new line that had not been there this morning. Not deep, not catastrophic, but permanent in a way the mind recognizes before the mirror does. "I should have done the right thing sooner," she said, and there was no heat in it, only truth. She buckled the kids into the car. The officers would finish the sweep, seal the entry points, schedule decontamination and restoration for the morning. The house would be cataloged and cleaned and made uninteresting to wildness again. The colony, what remained, would sleep tomorrow in a place built for them, not stolen from a family's ceiling. The county preserve would add a line to its ledger, one more fragile thing kept alive a little longer by boundaries and care. Sarah turned the key. The engine coughed and caught. She glanced back at the porch. Through the glass, the living room was still and ordinary, a square of lamplight on a rug. It looked impossibly like a room you could sit in to read a book. She pulled away from the curb. The sirens stayed quiet. The sky above the preserve, miles away, would be black and wide. The colony would find its place in that darkness. In the rearview mirror, her house receded without judgment. "Mom," Josh said, small again. "Yes? Will they come back?" "No," she said, and this time the word didn't waver. "They won't." Emma touched the towel to her cheek, eyes forward, jaw set. "Good," she whispered, and the single word held the weight of a promise she would keep. A steel she had not known was in her. Sarah drove toward the hospital's lights, toward paperwork and shots and the practical language of remedy. The road unspooled. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Somewhere behind them, professionals finished turning a storm back into rooms. Somewhere ahead, a doctor would wash a small wound and speak in precise, boring terms about prevention and care. Between those points, in the moving present where she kept her children in the circle of the car's light, Sarah understood the next chapter had already begun. By dawn, the house was quiet again. The storm had been contained, the last of the colony packed into secure crates and carried away by the animal control officers. The porch light flickered off with the automatic timer, leaving the Jenkins home sitting pale and hollow in the first gray wash of morning. From the outside, it looked normal. From within, Sarah knew it was changed forever. She walked back inside when the officers gave her permission. The air was different, treated with disinfectant, acrid with bleach, but under it still lingered the heavy, acrid shadow of what had been. The carpets were streaked with white powder, vents taped over, the attic hatch sealed shut with metal brackets. It was no longer a home invaded by wildness, but neither was it yet a sanctuary again. It was a shell in transition, carrying both the memory of the colony and the promise of reclamation. Her children clung close, exhausted. Emma's cheek bore its fresh line, red against pale skin, bandaged now by the emergency room nurse, but still vivid. Josh kept looking at it, his lips pressed into silence as if the mark itself carried more weight than any lecture could. Sarah bent down, kissed Emma's temple, then hugged Josh against her side. "It's over," she whispered. "They won't come back." The professionals had been clear. The colony was relocated to the county preserve, a space where their survival would no longer clash with human safety. There they would have darkness, trees, cliffs, and the echoing hollows meant for their kind. Not rafters above children's bedrooms, not vents above kitchen tables. Sarah signed the release forms with a hand that trembled, not from uncertainty, but from the finality of it all. She'd kept them too long. She had believed too strongly in her own choice to protect. Now, protection had taken another form: removal, boundaries, relocation. All that remained for Sarah was to restore her home, and so she did. The next days blurred with labor. She hired cleaners who suited up in masks and gloves, fumigating, scrubbing, sealing. She worked beside them, pushing through the nausea of bleach and the sting of dust, determined to leave nothing behind. Every crack in the siding was sealed, every vent reinforced with mesh, every trace of guano removed from the attic beams. The old cocoon that had started it all was scraped down, bagged, and taken away. She washed bedding, curtains, clothes until the machines rattled from use. Her hands blistered, her nails split, but she didn't stop until the smell was gone, until the house felt like theirs again. When the last worker left, Sarah stood alone in the silent attic. It looked new, bare beams scrubbed raw, light shining from the work lamp onto pale wood. She ran her palm along the grain and felt nothing but dryness. And yet, in her mind, she still heard the echoes, the whisper of claws, the restless stirring of wings, the thin, high buzz that once seemed holy. She closed her eyes, inhaled, and forced herself to exhale everything with the breath. Then she shut the hatch and locked it, this time for good. Life resumed its shape, though imperfectly. The children returned to school. Josh told his friends exaggerated stories about monsters in the attic until Sarah gently corrected him. Not monsters, just animals. Rare, but dangerous when too close. Emma grew quieter. At night, Sarah sometimes found her daughter standing at the bathroom mirror, touching the bandaged cheek, eyes distant. The cut healed, but the scar remained, a thin, pale stroke across her skin, a reminder no one could erase. It was not only Emma's face that had been marked. The whole family carried something invisible now, a wariness, a lesson pressed into bone. They had lived with a hidden danger, cherished it, excused it, until it showed its true edge. Sarah knew the scar was not only Emma's to carry, it was hers too, as a mother who had chosen wonder over safety, pride over caution. In time, the memory dulled. The smell of bleach faded, replaced again by coffee in the mornings and cinnamon from weekend baking. Laughter returned in bursts, though always shadowed by that single line on Emma's face. Friends who visited never noticed, but Sarah's eyes found it every time her daughter turned her head toward the light. One night, months later, Emma asked quietly, "Do you still think they were special?" Sarah paused before answering. "Yes," she admitted, "but I don't think they were meant to be ours." Emma nodded, touched her cheek, and went back to her book. Sarah turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway, listening to the house breathe in its true silence. The bats were gone. The shed was sealed. The attic was clean. Life went on, but the mark, on wood, on memory, on skin, remained, a reminder etched deeper than nails or claws could ever cut. Sarah had thought she was protecting a miracle. Instead, she had learned what it meant to guard her children, even against the beauty she wanted to preserve. And so she moved forward, wiser, scarred, and forever changed. What would you do in her place? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss our next story.